Hi, it's Jerry, and we're back today talking with Gwyn Lurie, the executive editor-in-chief of the Montecito Journal. Thank you for joining us. Gwyn, can you hear me okay?
Yep. Hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Everybody healthy?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that any 15-year-old is ever healthy or 13-year-old. But yes, we're healthy. We're, we're a little stir crazy, but we're glad we live in Santa Barbara and not other places right now.
How would you describe it? Are you self-quarantining, self-isolating?
Yeah, we have no one coming to our house. We're going on walks in the neighborhood a little bit. I have to say I went on a walk down our street the other day and someone had their dog off a leash. And I was a little surprised by my reaction. I was like, can you please put your dog on the leash? Like I was worried. You don't know like who a dog has been licking and then they're going to come over and lick my dogs and then my dogs are going to lick me.
So the dog wasn't wearing a mask.
The dog was not wearing a mask, but dogs, they're close to us. Like we kiss them and hug them. And so anyway, so I said, can you please put your dog on a leash? And she said, oh yes, I'm so sorry. So yeah, I mean, we're taking walks. Look, it's a little weird. And I remember after the debris flow, we stayed at a hotel for weeks downtown because we couldn't get to our house. And I remember walking downtown thinking it's so beautiful here. And 1 mile away, they're looking for bodies, And so it's a little bit of a weird dichotomy of like living in this beautiful place and knowing that the world is such a, hard place.
Yeah. All right. Well, speaking of the world, you got a new issue out Thursday, April 16th, which I want you to know, I've been just picked up, I'm rereading The Plague, and April 16th is the day that Dr. Ryu finds the rat that sets off the narrative. So I don't know if that's a good omen or bad, but anyway, so your cover story by Mitchell Kriegman is a pretty tough takedown of Santa Barbara City Hall and what is not happening there in terms of planning for economic recovery. And you introduce it with your editor's column in the beginning, and you have a quote from Warren Buffett, world's greatest capitalist. Talk about that. What's the quote and why did you use that?
Well, Warren Buffett famously said that when the tide goes out, you see who isn't wearing a bathing suit. And I just thought that was a good metaphor for needing to be prepared for these things. I mean, I moved here when we bought our home here in 2004, but we moved here full time in 2009. And since we've been here, there have been a lot of disasters. I mean, there hasn't been a pandemic, but there have been fires. There was a debris flow. There was a, recession, a serious recession. And I don't see our piece as a takedown, but I do think, Jerry, that the press needs to play a really important role right now. And I think that's asking really hard questions about what we're demanding or asking of our leaders. And I think that that there's a role for the leaders in our city to play right now, which is to form alliances with business leaders and health leaders and the press, honestly, have bigger conversations.
And that's not happening, according to Mitchell's story.
Do you think it's happening?
Not to my knowledge, but I want to start with a couple things. I want to pull out a couple things. One is this meeting on Friday, March 20th that he references. Two business leaders from downtown, Amy Cooper, who owns Plum Goods, and Keith Higbee, managing partner of SGV, took the initiative to talk to City Hall officials and say, hey, we got to figure out what we're going to do. How are we going to come out of this?
That's how I understand it, yeah.
Yeah, and so they had this 2.5-hour virtual meeting of public and private stakeholders, and they agreed to meet again, and they were going to do stuff. And then what happened is the mayor said, "What? I don't know anything about it." What is to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think Mitchell, who's been really deep into all this stuff, would be a great person to have a conversation with about all of his conversations. But according to Mitchell, there was a suggestion for this meeting on the 12th of March. The meeting came together on the 20th of March. And, you know, it wasn't just Amy and Keith in that meeting. I think Sherry Villanueva, I think there were a number of business leaders in that meeting. And I believe the mayor obviously was in that meeting. And I think that they mocked up an outline for a task force, an economic I think it was going to be called the Mayor's Economic Task Force. And apparently they had determined that it would cost about $15,000 to fund this task force. And I think some of that was probably for stipend and apparently they left.
And the point of the task force was to put together a strategy, right?
Well, a strategy for moving forward. I mean, that's the big, open question here is what's the long-term impact this is going to have on the economy at every level. So, I think this is going to necessitate a lot of strategic partnerships, and I don't want to overuse the term, but out of the box thinking. I think you never know who's going to have the good idea. And I think that brainstorming, and I think businesses bring their needs and their thoughts. And I think there's never been a better time to have these relationships. And I think that they weren't great before this happened.
And bottom line is nothing happened. Nothing after the meeting.
Not yet. Nothing has come out of it. I think my understanding, again, I didn't have the conversations, but my very clear understanding is that the people who attended that meeting left the meeting with the expectation that this would materialize, and it has not.
All right. So that's one thing. And then I guess he talked to the mayor, Kathy Murillo, and she says pandemic is the purview of the county. The county is the agency with medical doctors and behavioral health professionals. And Mitchell writes, considering the mayor came to office on the Montecito on the Montecito debris flow, and that the Montecito and Santa Barbara area seems to be on a disaster year schedule, one would think that the mayor and strategic minds in City Hall would have a plan, but they do not. And that was your takeaway from the piece that you edited?
Yes. I mean, look, I mean, and you asked me at the beginning about my Warren Buffett quote. So I think having a plan is part of, there's the bathing suit metaphor. I think that the mayor has a big job right now. I think the county has a big job right now. But I think these jobs are always big jobs. And I think that we live in a world where you just don't know what's the next disaster, economic, natural. And I think that part of being ready to, to navigate those disasters is to have good relationships with important stakeholders in your community. And I think that those relationships and those systems are not strongly in place. I don't think they were going into this, and I don't think they are now. And I liken it to a relationship. If you're in a marriage that isn't healthy or isn't strong, and suddenly, God forbid, a kid gets sick or you have some disaster, you better go to marriage counseling. You better figure it out. You better be able to put your problems behind you and move forward as a team and work through this disaster that's in front of you. And I just don't know that maybe there are efforts behind the scenes that I don't know about. And that's where, by the way, this economic development manager.
Let's talk about him, because Mitchell starts a piece out with an interview with Jason Harris, who has just been hired as the new, and really the first since redevelopment, economic development director for the city. And he's got to be wondering, what did I get myself into? Because the pandemic comes along. But he basically says, some people say the glass is half full, that's half empty. It's less than half empty. In fact, the glass is out the window. And he's basically acknowledges that there's this huge disconnect between City Hall and business. And you also see Ed St. George, a developer, and a bunch of other developers writing a letter to Newshawk calling for Paul Casey, the city administrator, to be relieved of command. So something is not going on right there.
Look, I don't know Paul, and I would actually like to talk to Paul. And I know Mitchell has now reached out to Paul to talk to him. He's spoken to Paul's spokesperson at this point, Nina Johnson.
And he writes very favorably about Nina, and she does work really hard.
I think she does. I think, he feels she's been very open to her. I think she's represented herself as his spokesperson. But I'm not calling for anyone's, or Montecito Journal, let me put it that way, is not calling for anyone's head on a platter. I just don't think this is a time to dress anything up to look good to the public. I think we need to look at things very honestly. And Jerry, you and I have had these conversations before, just with regard to what's going on. And I know just watching your conversation with Nick Welsh, he's felt some of the frustrations of wanting to get real stories about what's going on inside the hospitals, what's going on inside the city. I think that our job as the media is to inform people about where we're at and what's going on, and to put pressure on our elected officials to do what we believe is the right thing and what the people believe is the right thing. And so I don't think we're doing anyone a favor to tiptoe around these issues.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that sort of struck me in the piece, which again is out tomorrow, April 16th. Everybody should read it. The contrast between what's happening here and what's happening in San Luis Obispo, where he also talked to some officials, and where they do have a very robust, sounds like private, public, business, stakeholder thing going on for how are we going to get out of this? How are we going to get past this once the shutdown is over, once the immediate emergency is over? And they're very transparent about it. And I thought that contrast was troubling as well.
Well, as you know from reading The Long Now, Mitchell's first piece about State Street and the need for partnerships to have a vision and leadership in that direction to rebuild our downtown, that he used San Luis even then as an example of a sort of very forward-thinking city who was, forming these partnerships. And I think those very partnerships have now come together in REACH. I guess that's what you're referring to. The acronym is REACH, R-E-A-C-H. And they're having regular meetings with all these members of their community to try to think through this. And, all of these things that we're going through, the debris flow, the pandemic, we haven't gone through any of these things before. And so it can't be business as usual. It can't be just protect the coffers, because the fact of the matter is stuff needs to change. We know that about our country. I think that we all hope that we come out of this with better systems in place and better communication in place and, better relationships with the environment and all, I think we all hope that good things come out of some of these things. And so I think this is a time right now to have the bigger conversations and to be open to these kinds of really necessary partnerships, because governments are not equipped to handle these things by themselves.
Yeah. And, these partnerships and this communitarian sensibility that you're expressing, I mean, that was the motivating idea with which you went into the Montecito Journal, with which you pulled together this group of investors and bought the paper. And that was kind of what you've been very clear about wanting to do. But I'm going to guess here that in your plan for what to do for the first 100 days, a global pandemic was not on
part of it. That wasn't in our business plan. No.
Yeah, how has that affected the business?
Obviously, I'd be lying if I said it didn't affect the business. I mean, obviously, a big piece of our foundational business is the Montecito Journal, and it's supported by ad revenue, and businesses are hurting right now. People can't afford to advertise at the same levels, not the real estate business, not, um, uh, retail. So it's harder. It's definitely harder. But we are, first of all, I will say, just timing wise, it was really lucky that we had raised the capital that we raised right before this happened. So while it wasn't how I wanted to be spending some of that money right now, at least we have a little bit of a cushion, and that's lucky for us. And the other thing is that we're really having to think, again, to use this term, but think outside the box about how to help businesses. I mean, we can't, we need business needs us. And I think we are seeing really interesting examples of businesses pivoting in this environment and going about their business in different ways in order to stay afloat. And we're trying to help generate some of the ideas.
What's an example of how you're seeing that?
Well, I mean, I think you see farmers market people delivering food. I think, we approached some of our retail advertisers and suggested that they deliver clothing and things to people's house, let them try it on. They could pick it up. There could be adequate social distancing. We're having a call on Friday, excuse me, a Zoom call on Friday with as many leaders of the business community here in Montecito who can join. And we're just going to have a big brainstorming session about, some of our ideas of how to help get more resources to businesses and hear what their needs are, because they're our partners. So,
the scale of this is so, I mean, it's beyond extraordinary. I mean, it affects everything.
Completely pervasive. Yeah.
And I think, to their credit, that the county and public health officials have done a pretty good job of managing that piece of it. And, after some bumps and at the beginning, I have really become pretty transparent. But the next stage, and the governor has, of course, set up these markers for, how we lift the shelter at home thing, one of them being testing. But, this is a huge blow to the economy. I mean, Mitchell quotes, I think, a FEMA study, 40% of small businesses don't come back from disasters. And this is beyond a disaster. I mean, we're really in catastrophe territory. So, what's kind of the atmospherics? What are the mood of people that you're talking to, business leaders and people who are, work for themselves or professionals and so on in Montecito?
I think people are scared. I think part of what's scary is what they fear the most. And part of what's scary is the unknowns. I mean, even you just read our story last week about Riviera Bank, with the interview with Jeff Devine. I mean, these banks have had a huge order plopped on their plate. And
because they're supposed to be managing all of the SBA money, payroll
loans, and they're scared that if they fill out the application with one wrong word, that they're going to be left holding the bag. And they, these banks, these local banks, they maybe do 500 loans a year. They're asked to do 1,500 in 2 weeks. It's like, it's a magnitude that they've never had to and there's none of the due diligence. There's no, this is just all about trusting that the government is going to reimburse them for these loans. And they want to help. I mean, that's the thing about our community, is that we're all neighbors and we're friends and we know each other and we bank at these banks and we go to school at these schools and our elected officials live down the street, so it's like everyone wants to make sure everyone lands on their feet, but it's very tough. And you talk about, the county and I think they're working very hard. I think they've been, at least from my experience, very accessible. I had a long conversation with Greg Hart the other day about different ways that we can help local businesses and restaurants. I've talked to Doss about it, and he's in fact going to join our call on Friday with the businesses to try to answer questions and try to understand what their needs are.
Have you talked to Salud?
I have. I had a long conversation with Salud. He's the one that talked me through what San Luis Obispo was doing with Reach. And, I think he agrees that it's not being done perfectly. I don't mean pointing fingers at anyone in particular, but that this is new for all of us, and they're trying to figure it out. And listen, he has his own frustrations dealing with his own, our federal government and his feelings about the way this is being handled, and, who's running things and how it's being, how the buck is being passed to, local and state governments. So he has all his own frustrations, and he's going to join the call on Friday too, to talk to the business.
Those three guys that you just mentioned, Greg and Salud and Doss, do you feel like when you spoke with them that they understood that they got the magnitude of what this is and
Totally.
the kind of imagination? I mean, the worst thing that's going to happen about going forward is a failure of imagination. And anyone who didn't see this had a failure of imagination. Of course, some people saw it coming.
Look, I believe we knew the debris flow was coming. It's like I think that there is a myopia in government in general, and I think that there is a lot expected of our leaders, and I think it's very easy to just look at what's in front of you. And I think that, it's a very rare leader that has that kind of big picture that's sitting back, and I think right now calls for leaders to look not just 2 feet in front of their face, but a couple of miles down the road. And, but I do think that all the 3 people I just spoke of, I think they understand the magnitude. I think they're open to ideas. I think they're working as hard as they can. But I think that, look, Doss and Greg are part of a board. They're not executive. They don't have the bully pulpit of an executive leader. Although, Greg, as the chair, has been holding press conferences and meetings and trying to answer as many questions as he can. I think that Salud is part of a Congress that, you can just imagine. So
what you just said about sitting back and thinking big seems to me, and has always seemed to me, to be sort of part of the responsibility of news organizations, of the media. In other words, our job is to kind of look at everything that's going on and try to help set the agenda for how we go forward. And I respect your efforts to be doing that. And I think that's exactly what you're trying to do. Real quickly, can you talk a little bit about the home delivery? Because that's been something that's, really, I think, an adaptation at a time of great confusion. You've been able to get the paper out.
Well, it was one of the ways we're trying to pivot. We're trying to meet the need of a moment, and people aren't leaving their houses so much. And
how many papers are you printing now?
A little over 15,000. We're up about 3,000 or so.
Oh, your press run is up?
Our press run is up. We're delivering to homes in Montecito, Summerlin, many parts of Santa Barbara. We're going to now try to get to Hope Ranch a little bit. We are, we're doing everything we can to get the news to people, but we're also building a very robust digital site.
What's going on with that? When are we?
That'll be launched June 1st. But as of the 26th of this month, we're starting to go out with a newsletter. That's going to be a weekly newsletter that's going to go via email. And so that's being built, and we're sending out our first sort of test run on the 26th of April, where we're going to ask people to subscribe to that. So we're trying to reach people every way possible. And and listen, our very strong hope.
Oh, you just got Zoom bombed by your dog.
Yeah, they had a very important meeting they had to get to outside.
All right. That was great.
Anyway, we're doing everything we can.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gwyn Lurie, for talking with us. And everybody should check out the new issue, which I think is a really excellent piece. And thank you for giving me a peek of it in advance.
Thank you. I think you're doing a great job too. Could I give a shout out to you on this? I really appreciate, I do. I really appreciate your coverage, and you're such a good writer and smart reporter. And I really appreciate what you're doing.
All right, my dear, hang in and
stay safe. 6 feet. 6 feet.
One foot in front of the other. Talk to you.
Okay. Bye.